I mean, all the important people are. Oh, no, there we go. Now they're watching from home, maybe. All right. Come on in and get comfortable. It's another Sunday morning. We're blessed to be here. We're going to spend some time talking about another unsung hero, if you will, in this series. Last week we talked a little bit about Shamgar. Hopefully that was an enlightening offering. We'll appreciate that. Not somebody we talk about every day. Today we're going to talk about somebody new. This is I said last week that some of these people are going to be familiar to you, some of them not so much familiar to you. This is, we're going to talk today about somebody whose name you've heard before, for sure. And actually who we know probably a pretty fair amount, especially when we talk about unsung heroes, pretty fair amount about this person in particular. And I get excited because this is like a top 5 Bible character, particularly in the Old Testament for me. This is one of my favorite people in all the Bible and all of Scripture to talk about. And so we're going to be taking a look at somebody this morning that lived a lifetime of faithfulness. That's pretty impressive. There's not too many people that can really claim that. But we're going to dive into that in a little bit. Before we get started this morning a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about names. Who knows what their name means? Do you know what your name means? Would you share with us? Advisor? Okay.
And the Laban means the advisor.
The advisor, okay. Portia? Fast car, yeah. I was going to say luxury vehicle. Yeah, no, that's perfect. You know those little cards they used to give you when you're little that has your name on it and tells you what the biblical meaning of your name is? Michael meant one who is like God.
All right, yeah.
So I don't know if you had that in mind when you named me that, but no, not at all. What's in a name? Well, you know, sometimes not a whole lot. Sometimes there can be a lot of depth in that. We're going to talk about a guy this morning whose name had a meaning. And when you think about meanings that you'd want, it's far from luxury vehicle or even the advisor. The person we're going to talk about this morning, his name literally means the dog. One who is dog-like. That's not the number one name that I would think of as wanting to be associated with. But, yes, his name means one who is like a dog. A dog, a D-O-G. We're getting there. Yeah. So, but when you think about some of the traits and characteristics of a dog, this person that we're going to talk about this morning was very loyal, very protective. It had all those kind of traits that the name really does kind of suit him. So this morning we're going to go back into the Old Testament and we are going to look at the story of the unsung hero, mostly because he wasn't necessarily an unsung hero, but he lived in the shadow of somebody else his entire life. And this morning we're going to talk about Caleb. Caleb, as in Caleb and Joshua, as in that Caleb, as in the spy. So we know a fair amount about Caleb. What do we know about Caleb in general? What do you guys know? We're all biblical scholars here, right? Aspiring, at least. What do we know about Caleb? Go ahead, yeah.
He was the one that asked God to give him this mountain.
That's true. Absolutely. So Caleb is one that is definitely, when they talk about the Israelites moving into the promised land, he was one of the spies. That's usually what people remember most about Caleb, right? He was one of the 12 spies that went in and scoped out the land. When all the spies came back and 10 of the spies said, we don't think we can take this land, Caleb and Joshua, and particularly, we're going to find out this morning, Caleb were the ones that spoke up and said, no, absolutely not. We can do this. We got God on our side, guys. So he was one of the 12 spies. We're going to learn a little bit more about him. We see a little bit about his story in Numbers 13 is the story about the 12 spies going out. If you want to turn your Bibles to Numbers 13, and we see there at the beginning of Numbers 13, the Lord said to Moses, send out men to explore to Canaan, one from each tribe. Caleb is chosen from the tribe of, anybody know? Extra special bonus Bible points? Comes from the tribe of Judah, which is an interesting one. We know that Caleb, the son of Jephunneh from the tribe of Judah, was chosen as the spy for the tribe of Judah. He goes along with these folks. They go out into the land. They go up into the high mountain areas of the land to check it out, learn a little bit about it. And he looks around and he says, hey, this is a great land. When they come back, they tell Moses, we went into the land. It's fruitful. It's full of milk and honey. It's wonderful. The people, though, are very scary. They're like giants to us. We must look like grasshoppers to them. There's no way we can take this. As great as it is, there's no way we can take this. In verse 30, Caleb told the people to be quiet. He said, no. As the tension started rising, people are like, well, we can't do this. Caleb literally says in verse 30, he steps up and he tells the people to be quiet and listen to Moses. And Caleb said, let's go now and take possession of this land. We should be more than able to conquer it. Now think about that for a minute. You had 12 men, 10 of which come back, and Joseph gets a lot of credit for being in on this, but Caleb is really the one we see speaking up here. He says, there's no reason why we can't take this land. Absolutely none. He's the first voice, really, of dissension amongst these people. And while these 10 come back, and literally we see in Scripture here that people are getting ready to pick up stones and get rid of Moses and Aaron. Think about where we're at in this time. They've been in the wilderness, they've gotten to the promised land, and they're literally grumbling and complaining, saying, well, we're here, but there's no way we can get in. It's not even worth knocking on the door. Caleb's the one who steps up and says, we can more than do this. But the men had gone mad. The men who had gone with him said, we can't attack these people. They're too strong for us. And they began to spread lies amongst the Israelites about the land that they had explored. They said, the land we explored will devour those who live there. All the people we saw there are very tall. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak. And the descendants of Anak were known to be giants. Keep that in mind. File that away. We're going to come back to that. That there were these giants there that they were very afraid of. We felt as small as grasshoppers, and that's how we must have looked to them. And so we have this entire, think about just briefly about what Israel's gone through at this point. They've been through the 12 plagues. They've escaped. They've gotten to the Red Sea. They've passed through the Red Sea. And they've actually made a relatively quick trip to the Promised Land. We kind of forget about that at this point. They go in, they spy it out, they take a look. Caleb and Joshua say, hey, we can do this. And everyone else says, no, we can't. And that's the point, really, where God's going to be like, great, guess what? I'm done with this. In fact, he literally goes on and says, I'm going to start over with you, Moses. Forget this. He says, we're not going to do this. And Moses talks him out of it. And as a result, the Israelites spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. We know that story pretty well. In fact, he says that he's going to spare only those that are younger than 20 years to be spared from having to go through all of this. We read about that in Numbers 14. So in Numbers 14, at the beginning in verse 4, the Israelites are literally saying, let's choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Stop for a minute and think about that. About all that God had done to deliver these people from Egypt. And all they've heard is, these guys are really big, we can't do it. All the things that they've walked through dry land, through an ocean, through a sea. They have seen the power of God through all of these wonderful acts. They're literally following a pillar of fire during the day and a pillar of smoke and a pillar of fire. These people literally are living in the presence of God. And still, they don't get it. And so my first question is, how can they be so stupid? How can they be so dumb? I mean, we certainly, in the face of overwhelming evidence and understanding and faith that we serve a God that is alive, we would never do that, would we? Maybe I spoke a little hastily, right? Maybe we should pump the brakes on that a little bit. Because maybe we don't see a physical manifestation of God in this building this morning, but that God is still every bit as powerful and as present in our lives. And how often do we take that for granted? How quick are we to conveniently forget about that? We talked last week about how easy it is for us and how adept we are at making excuses. The people of God, we see this all throughout time, and it's easy for us to say, well, those Israelites, they were really foolish. Well, 1,000 years from now, if someone's writing the history of us, what is it going to look like to people reading it? How could they not do more with what they have, right? We talked about that with Shamgar last week. When we skip down to verse 5, when the Israelites are saying, let's go back to Egypt, Immediately, Moses and Aaron bowed down with their faces touching the ground, and the whole community of Israel assembled there. At that time, two of those who explored the land, Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, tore their clothes in despair. So Caleb and Joshua are really standing out as the leaders here, who are right there behind Moses and Aaron. They tore their clothes. They said to the whole community of Israel, "The land that we explored is very good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us this land and give it to us. This land is flowing with milk and honey. Don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. We will devour them like bread. They have no protection, and the Lord is with us, so do not be afraid of them." We look at the enemies and I say enemies, we don't maybe necessarily term them as enemies, but we look at the things that keep us away from our godly living, the distractions that are in our lives. How often do we look at them and say, those are things that are easy to overcome? We'll devour it. Throw a challenge in my way, I will devour it. I will take it on gladly because it is nothing in relation to the greatness of God. Could you imagine what would happen if we really were able to have that mindset? Caleb, we see, has that mindset early on, and he's going to maintain that mindset. When we skip down to verse 22, we learn a little bit more about Caleb. It said, in verse 22 begins, "None of the people who saw my glory and miraculous signs I did in Egypt and in the desert will see the land which I promised to their ancestors." This is God speaking now. And he's telling Moses, none of the people who saw my glory and miraculous signs are going to see the inside of the promised land. It's not going to happen. Oh, them of little faith. They've ticked me off one too many times. They've questioned me. They've stood in my way. I've given them everything. I've brought them right to the front door, and they're going to refuse and say they want to go back to Egypt. None of them are going to see the promised land. And then in verse 24 of Numbers 14, "But because my servant Caleb has a different attitude and has wholeheartedly followed me, I will bring him into the land already explored, and his descendants will possess it." That's pretty amazing. These are the words of God to Moses. We all like to know that God knows us all by name, but you don't often see him call somebody out by name. Not only that, but he refers to Caleb in verse 24. Did anybody catch that? He refers to Caleb as my servant. That's pretty powerful attested, isn't it? Do you know how many times God had said that up until this point about somebody in the Bible? We've had the whole history from Adam to now. You know how many times God has said that? Once. About Moses. Caleb is now in a category, not completely of his own, but a very, very elite category. He is one of two people that God has said, "This is my servant." That's an amazing thing. Even more so when you think about Caleb's background. You skip down to verse 29 of Numbers 14. And then we hear that your bodies will drop dead in the desert. He's talking about the Israelites. "All of you who are at least 20 years of age, who were registered and listed, and who complained about me, will die in the wilderness. I raised my hand and swore an oath to give you this land to live in. But none of you will enter it except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun." So we see here that now we're starting to see Joshua included as well. He is certainly an important part of this. I think probably one of the most vehement, I don't want to say arguments, it wasn't an argument, but biblical discussions that I've ever had with Tim is about this very thing. You have to pay attention now. No. Because Tim and I had a big debate one time, not a big debate, I'm making this way more than it was, a discussion. And just because I love Caleb, I'm Team Caleb, I confess it right now, right up front, always argue that if Caleb would have been in charge instead of Joshua, things would have looked a lot different when they went into the promised land. In fact, we see in Joshua 24:15 when Joshua stands up and says, "Hey, choose this day whom you're going to serve, whether the God of the Israelites who delivered you or the God of the land you now live." He's not exactly waving the white flag. He is a father of faithfulness, but he stops fighting. And at that same time, Caleb's like, "All right, give me my mountain. We're going to go up and we're going to take on the giants." And of course, Tim combated back with, "Well, God knew what he was doing. He played the God card on me, and rightfully so. You're right. But I'm still Team Caleb." I think if Caleb would have been in charge, he never, never, never stops. He is relentless. He literally looks at the enemies of God like bread, and every time he eats more of it, he gets that carbo boost to go after the next one. He's an amazing character, and even though we know a little bit about him, we don't know nearly as much as we should, and we don't glean as many of the important lessons from him that I think we can. So we're going to talk about him a little bit more today, about some of the things that God did for him and some of the things that he did for God in his lifetime. So a lifetime of faithfulness. Caleb, a man named Dog, and what he was able to do to the glory of God. We know about his story. Caleb was a descendant of a man who was, and this is interesting too, Caleb was a descendant of a man who was a Kenizzite. Anybody remember that tribe? It's not. It is not a tribe. His father was, and probably very controversially so, was most likely a convert. He was from a tribe that actually lived in the Promised Land. His father, more than likely, with their family, probably went to Egypt at the same time that the Israelites did to escape the famine. And his father, for some way or another, married a Jewish woman, converted, and we see that Caleb is a half-Jew. Why is that important? Well, to us, it probably isn't very important, but to a people who are very meticulous and very particular about their bloodlines, that would have meant something. And the fact that Caleb, being a half-Jew, being a dog, was seen with enough esteem and enough respect to be chosen as the leader of his people to go into the Promised Land means that he was a tremendous person. He was able to overcome that much more in his life. And so we see that Caleb in Hebrew means dog-like. We talked a little bit about that nickname. So what do we know about Caleb? We know that Caleb had to be a respected man in his community because he was chosen as the person to represent Judah. What do we know about the tribe of Judah in general? Lots of things about the tribe of Judah, right? Who's going to come from this line in the tribe of Judah? Jesus, David, all the big guys, all the big heavy hitters. God seems to love the hearts of the people who come out of the tribe of Judah. And I think in a big way that starts with Caleb. And so we see that he was respected, not just respected, but respected out of a tribe of people that had a heart traditionally that was really leaning towards God. Caleb is one, we talked about this, Caleb is one person that's called my servant by God in Numbers 14:24. It's a position of the highest honor. Only one other person has that at this point in time. Caleb worked, and he was a worker. Caleb worked under Pharaoh. Caleb worked under Moses. Caleb worked under Joshua. But Caleb never forgot that who he really needed to work for and who he really, truly served was God. And we're going to see that throughout his entire life. He never forgets that. And if there is any lesson that we could never forget in our lives, wouldn't it be that we should always keep God first? It's so simple, and yet it is not so simple at all, is it? Not in practice. That's why the example of Caleb is so important to us. Caleb will tell us himself in Scripture that he followed the Lord. Joshua tells us that Caleb is a follower of the Lord. Even God said on 3 different occasions that Caleb follows him wholeheartedly. 7 times in the Bible, Caleb is identified as somebody who followed God with his whole heart. Not once, not twice, but 7 times we hear in Scripture that Caleb, that's a guy who follows God wholeheartedly. And it's easy to see why he was so respected. It's easy to see why he commanded so much respect and was held up to such a high degree amongst his people, despite the fact that he was a half-Jew, despite the fact that all these things that could have detracted from him. Caleb overcomes all that, not through his own power, but by making himself a servant to the Almighty God. There's certainly a lesson in there for us on that. It's a testament to his faith. It's a testament to his life. How many of us could make that claim? To have wholeheartedly followed God 100% with everything we have. Caleb could, because Caleb did. And that's an amazing thing. He wholeheartedly followed God because he knew that if you half-heartedly follow God, you will never overcome the giants in your life. Think about that for a minute, because we recognize Caleb as a giant fighter. We know that ultimately when they go in and take the promised land, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, that he goes and seeks out those who are descendants of the giants. He goes and finds the biggest, baddest folks because, quite frankly, they had the best land. And that was promised to him, and he was not going to die before he saw his tribe take that area. But he knew that if you half-heartedly follow God, you're never going to overcome the giants in your life. And we can take that and interpret it any number of ways, but we can't negate the truth to a statement like that. If we are wholeheartedly devoted to God, we'll find that the giants in our lives can take care of themselves. That we can easily overcome the things that other people would look at and say, there's no way. Yes?
When we look at the attributes of a dog, we know that they're usually loyal and they're dedicated to their master. And with his name meaning dog, when you read that backwards, it's God.
That's true.
And so, just a bit of trivia.
So maybe he was just a little dyslexic. And Irene.
I just wanted to add that with him being half and half, I would think that he probably felt some pressure as well to work harder to be recognized and to be accepted. Sometimes if you're not with the crowd, you have to work harder to be recognized and to be noted. So I would think that he had that pressure, and I'm glad he lived up to it.
That's possible. Yeah, that's possible. Irene was saying that he may have been under pressure because he didn't have this pure kind of Jewish bloodline, and that maybe that drove him to work harder. Maybe that's true. Absolutely. I don't know if I want to believe that, or I want to believe that he was just somebody whose identity was so entwined with God that he just didn't think about those things. But either way, he certainly had a deck stacked against him when it came to justifying himself to his fellow people. Yes?
We have to understand one thing, that when you believe who God is, there is a conviction there. And then once you've been convicted, it's like before we came members of the body of Christ, we were convicted on who God is. And then we became converted to his word. Now, once we become convicted and converted to believing who God is, there is a commitment there.
Absolutely.
And so, Caleb, he believed God, so he was convicted and converted. And then he made a commitment because of those two things, those two C's, convicted and converted. He became committed to doing whatever God had him to do. And we, in turn, need to have that same attitude. We need to be convicted and converted, because a lot of folks are convicted, but they're not converted.
That's true. So that leads into my next point, which is a question for you to contemplate this morning. So we'll do this from time to time through this course. A question for you to contemplate this morning: are you sold out for God? Think about it. What would happen if you did sell out 100% for God? And what would it take to convince you that that's the choice that you should make? What would it take to convince you to overcome all the objections, all the excuses in your life to allow you to live a life like that? So maybe it's that you need to know God better. Maybe it's that you need to spend more time in worship or more time in the Word. We certainly all do. Maybe it's that you need to, like Shamgar, be willing to use the gifts that you already have and allow God to use those. We need to rid ourselves from the sins that we carry. And what will it take for you to follow the example of Caleb and follow God fully? There's the old adage that sports teams, coaches love, but the old story about when Julius Caesar actually and the Romans tried to take over Great Britain. You guys have heard this analogy before, perhaps. It was very difficult. It was an island. They had to sail across. The Celts who were on the island were well defended. They tried once and failed. And so the second time they took a two-sided approach. They sent ships this way and ships this way, and Julius Caesar was supposed to be the backup. He landed and had some folks that came and weren't too keen on the idea of them being there and started fighting. And the Romans literally started saying, hey, you know what? Maybe we should pull back a little bit. Maybe we should think about this. Maybe we should wait for the initial strike to start on the other side and detract away from all of this. What do you think, Julius Caesar? And Julius Caesar said, there is no going home. the minute we stepped on this land, we were on the Holy Roman Empire. So you know what? Burn the ships. There was no retreat. There was no going back. He had burned his bridge back to escape. And after that, ironically, that had just about as much of an effect on his soldiers as it did the enemies. They saw that there was no going back for these people. And so they ended up taking the island, as we would know through history. But it took that bold statement, that bold declaration to burn any opportunity to turn back. That's the same kind of mindset we see Caleb taking. And that's the same kind of mindset that we need as well. What is it going to take for us to burn the bridges between us and the sin that we carry? Because a lot of the excuses that we use when we talk about why we can't wholeheartedly give in to God is driven from the excuses that we carry along with our sin. Whether it's, I'm not worthy, whether it's, oh, but God can't love me because of this, whatever it is, we're wrong. There is no separation from us if we give those things away. So what is it going to take for us to burn that bridge, to burn those ships and that separate us from truly giving ourselves wholeheartedly to God? Because when you follow the Lord wholeheartedly, you do not need a path of retreat. And Caleb gets that. From the very beginning, Caleb gets that. Oh, they're big? Okay, good. They're like bread, more bread. Let's go eat. Oh, they're in fortified cities? Okay, we have a God. We have the God. What's the excuse? And so even amongst ourselves, when we come up with excuses, what are we going to do to call each other out? What are we going to do to strengthen our resolve to be sold out for God? When you follow the Lord wholeheartedly, you don't need a path of retreat. Caleb is also characterized by a special cause. He knew that God had spared his life in order for him to reach this special cause. Have you ever had someone who said, God has spared my life so that I can do this? Literally, God is keeping me alive so I can do this. We see that when we look at this allotment in Joshua 14. In Joshua 14, verses 6 through 13, we see that the Israelites have now entered the land. They're starting to fight. They're working together. And then we see that the people of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, you know what the Lord and Moses said to the man of God at Kadesh Barnea, and you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me to Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. And I brought back a report according to my convictions, but my fellow Israelites, who went up with me, made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. So on that day Moses swore to me, the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord your God wholeheartedly. And listen to what he says in verse 10. Now then, just as the Lord had promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he had said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. And so here I am today at 85 years old, ready to take on that promise, ready to step into my inheritance. He literally says, God has kept me alive just so that I could make good on this promise, and just so that he could make good on his promise to me. In verse 10, we said Caleb told that the Lord kept me alive. He'd been spared. But for what purpose? What purpose was Caleb truly spared for? Was it really just so that his family could have that? His family could have had that either way, right? He was kept alive to serve God. That was his purpose. And you know what? Caleb knew that. Caleb knew what his purpose was. His purpose was to serve God. Through all the plagues of Egypt, God kept him alive. Through all of the spying in the land, amongst the grasshoppers, amongst the giants, God kept Caleb alive. In the wilderness, as they wandered about, and everyone in his generation died and perished in the wilderness, God kept Caleb alive. When the Israelites were picking up stones to kill him, Joshua, Moses, and Aaron, God kept Caleb alive. Through all of the battles that they went into the promised land and fought, God kept Caleb alive so that he could be wholly devoted to serve him. And we see it. he was a living example to all of Israel for his entire life. God did this because God, and this is the next big important thing for you to write down here, we all know this, but God did this because God is a keeper. He keeps those that follow him. And we can give a testimony of that, and we should give a testimony of that in the way that we live. God is a keeper. He's a keeper of his word. He is a keeper of his people. He is a keeper of his promises. Do we do a very good job of recognizing ourselves as people that God has made a promise to keep? That God has made a promise to watch over, to deliver, to grant an eternity of being with him? Do we really live our lives in a way that reflect that? Because Caleb did. Caleb does. All throughout his life, he's an enormous example of how we should go about our relationship with God. As a result of God being a keeper and of Caleb recognizing this, of Caleb truly living a life of servitude to God, God is going to protect Caleb. He's going to keep him alive. But I'm going to go a little bit farther and say that God is going to protect him from 3 specific things. So these are our 3 points this morning. And like your 3 C's, these are going to be 3 D's. God is going to keep and protect Caleb from these 3 D's. The first one, the first big one, discouragement. Did Caleb have an opportunity to be discouraged? Every day. Every day. How many days could you eat manna and quail in the wilderness before you said, you know what, something else would taste really good? How many times could you see, God put the plagues out on the Egyptians before you said, I'm going to change my mind about some of these things? How many times did you have to go into battle and look for discouragement? It finds you. And it seeks you out. It sought Caleb out his entire life. But God protects him from discouragement. The 10 spies discouraged him, but he wholly served the Lord. None of the spies denied the report that the land was good. You notice that. In fact, they go the opposite direction. They say, hey, it's great. It's awesome. Great place to visit. They're not going to let us stay. Well, we're not inviting them to stay. It's our land, right? Caleb got that. He didn't fall into the trap of that discouragement. Caleb had a different attitude, and he was a delight to God because of that attitude. It didn't matter if there were giants or fortified cities, God would and could keep his promise. He had the title deed in his pocket and a sword in his hand, and he knew that God would keep him despite what this life might throw at him. Caleb knew. He knew he was going to see that land. He knew that God had made a promise. And so did he need to seek out discouragement? Did he have the ultimate weapon to battle back against discouragement? He believed. He was wholeheartedly believing in what God had told him to do. And so God is going to protect him and going to deliver him from discouragement. When everyone else wanted to give up and go back to Egypt, to retreat, to be discouraged, when everyone else was willing to just get back on the boats, Caleb got out his torch, set him ablaze. There was no discouragement. There was no going back. He never lost sight of the fact that the giants were ahead of us, and they were just begging to be taken down. God had already given it to him. God had delivered him for it, and so he didn't have any need for discouragement. The second thing, the second D word here that God is going to deliver Caleb from is disbelief. What would you give? What would you give to be able to say, I can rid myself of any disbelief? In anything, not necessarily just spiritual matters. If I could rid myself of disbelief, how much easier would your life be? How much less stress would you have to endure if you could just get rid of your disbelief? In fact, several times, Christ looked at crowds and said, look, because of your disbelief, you're really limiting what you're able to do. God protected Caleb from disbelief. Caleb refused to lose sight of the fact that God had delivered them, time and time again. He was the one guy who was looking around going, are you guys crazy? It's almost as if he was sitting here today reading about it and being like, they were so stupid. Like he got it in that moment. He understood. He didn't have to deal with disbelief. Caleb refused to believe that God wouldn't deliver on the promise that he made to his people. He refused. How often do we allow people to bring us down with their disbelief? How easily are we dissuaded by someone else's disbelief? How resolved do you have to be that when somebody says, but what about this? But maybe it didn't happen that way. But maybe, there's a lot, who knows, What does it take for us? How much resolve do we have to combat against that disbelief? I wish that Caleb were here and we could ask him, because I could tell you, I think he'd say, all it takes is believing in God. Believe in the one who keeps his promises, who keeps his people. He's done it before. He's doing it now. He's going to do it again. Just believe. There's no need for disbelief. Did the Israelites believe that they could walk through the Red Sea? Probably not, until the water parted and God made it happen. Yes, Jeannie.
As a baby Christian and through these years, I had somebody say, believe your beliefs and doubt your doubts. Because when you're trying to, Satan's always throwing those arrows, trying to get you. I think that's our greatest sin, is that God is saying, you can believe in me. And Satan says, no, you can't. It's the same old voice, that we've got to tune out and listen to the right voice.
Believe your beliefs and doubt your doubts. There's some wisdom in that, I think. Caleb was brave among cowards, and he was sure among those who disbelieved. And that's why he stands out. He stands out so much that God makes a point of saying, look at Caleb, my servant. He gets it. This is the example that you should follow. Do you have something?
One of the things I learned in life about Christianity, folk are afraid of change. They're used to doing it this way. They're used to doing it that way. And who knows what the outcome is if we don't allow them to change.
Yeah.
Now, your outlook determines your outcome. If you see only the problem, you will be defeated.
Mm-hmm.
But if you see the possibilities in the problem, there's victory.
Yeah.
So we have to understand and accept change in life. We can't be stuck on, well, we used to do it this way. Who knows?
Yeah.
Only God knows. Step out on faith.
We step out on faith, and we recognize that every problem that we come across in our lives has an opportunity for us to learn and grow from it. Has an opportunity, and we know from last week that God has empowered us with the tools that we need to overcome it, if we'll just believe in that and put faith in that. The third thing that God is going to protect and keep Caleb from is death. Caleb overcame death. Only 2 members of his generation survived the wilderness. Think about that for a minute. That's a crazy thing to think about. Two people who were delivered from Egypt saw the promised land and they could take it. 3 if you count Aaron, I suppose. Caleb refused to believe that God wouldn't deliver, jumping backwards in my notes. Caleb overcame death. Only 2 members of his generation survived the wilderness. Caleb understood that God spared his life for a special purpose. And he lived every day of his life fighting to fulfill that special purpose. He knew that he was going to step on that property again. He knew that he would walk those hills that he spied out again because God told him it's going to be yours. So he didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. He didn't have to be burdened by the disbelief. He knew in his heart of hearts, he knew that God would keep that promise clear. God gave him the strength for the task. In verse 11, he says that he's as strong today as the day that God delivered him. As the day what happened? God delivered him. Even in that, he recognizes that he was delivered from death by God. Caleb expected the promise to be filled, and he wasn't going to let discouragement, disbelief, and not even death stop him from getting to that point, from getting to stand on top of that mountain, from getting to face those giants that God had placed in his way. Instead of wanting to retire when he turns 85, we wouldn't fault him for that. We don't really fault Joshua when he's down in the valley and says, you know what, my days of fighting are over. But at 85 years old, instead of wanting to retire, Caleb still had the health, the energy, and the desire to stay in the game. At 85 years old, Caleb picks the biggest battle that he can find against the biggest people that he can find. He wants the giants up in the mountains in the fortified cities. Why? What would possess somebody from that, to do that, to make that decision? Not self-preservation. Is because he knew that God would deliver. And he never questioned that. Because he never had a reason to question it, because God kept his promises, and Caleb recognized that. When no one else would, Caleb recognized it. He'd been delivered from death for the moment that he was going to claim his reward. And it's not by any kind of design, but I liked what Tim said this morning. He said, if you have a pulse, you have a purpose. Caleb is a living embodiment of that, right? All the way up until his last day, he was ready to fight. He was ready to throw down to prove that God was right. Because he knew, surprisingly enough, God is right. Do we know that God is right? Do we? What are we doing about it? What are we can come here, we can praise him, and you know what? Some of us can hold down a pew really good, but what are we doing to show that God has made a change in our lives? What are we doing to make that step towards being 100% sold out for God? And maybe that's a thing to think about in your time. It's something I like to think about in my time. Well, I say I like to, but sometimes I don't like the conclusion I come to. Think about, on a scale of 1 to 100, where's your desire to follow God? Where is your belief? Every time we see Caleb, he's right there at 100. If you're not there, you have an example. You have multiple examples. But likely you have something else too. You got a lot of doubt, a lot of disbelief, a lot of fear, and a lot of excuses. What are we going to do to separate ourselves from those excuses? What are we going to do to burn the ships that are giving us an excuse to retreat from God and his will in our life? When we're young, it's easy to think that the greatest thing we'll ever do for God will be in the years ahead of us. But when you're at the end of your life, Caleb shows that there's always more that can be done for those who choose to truly serve God fully. Caleb took on the giants, and with God on his side, he had the strength to overcome them. And he never doubted it. Caleb refused to believe he was a nobody. The 10 spies called the Israelites grasshoppers. They said, we are like nobody to these people. But Caleb knew that they could overcome giants. Do you believe that in your own life? Have you ever faced a giant and said, you know what, I can handle this? Or are we too quick to say, you know what, I'm going to step back a little bit? Somebody else, you know what, God will call a David on this situation with a slingshot. I'll just be one of the guys who's there to witness it. What if Shamgar had taken that approach? What happens when we take that approach? We're limiting God's ability to use us, to utilize us to do his will. And that's a dangerous situation to be in. It's not what we're called to do or what we're called to be. For Caleb, it's almost as if he says, I'm going to have lunch, and the next meal is going to give me the strength to overcome the next. These guys are bread, and as soon as I eat this one, it's going to give me the power I need to eat the next one. He just keeps going. He just is empowered by God and God's power to move forward relentlessly. And he does it time and again. And that's the way we need to address the giants in our lives. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do we overcome the giants, the spiritual giants in our lives, the things that take us away from God? One step at a time. We make a pledge, as Caleb did, to give ourselves, to sell out 100% to God's will in our lives, and we take it a step at a time. Yes, Jeannie?
Sometimes you need to just turn your back on them and walk away from the giants. I mean, that's how you overcome certain things like drugs or sin
Sure.
or lust or whatever. You can't play with it. You got to just walk away from it.
So, yes, there are sins and vices in our world that the approach is you recognize that you're better off with nothing to do with it. Certainly, absolutely. But let's not forget the fact that God gives us the strength. It's not of our own power that we overcome these things. It's God who gives us the strength. And if we'll remember that, then we don't have to worry about whether we're equipped or not. Shamgar didn't. Caleb doesn't. God gives us the strength. God gave Caleb the strength to overcome gray hairs. He gave Caleb the strength to remain young, to fulfill the promise, and to be a faithful servant. When Caleb got to the mountains, he was as close that he was ever going to be in this world to where he was going to end up ultimately. He stood on the mountain. He ended his life on the mountain, standing on top of the Lord's enemies, at a highest altitude that he could get on this world, knowing that when he left this world, he was destined for someplace better. If we can have that same dedication to sell out 100%, we will find that we will ascend over all of the enemies in our lives, all of the detractors, all of the excuses, all the things that keep us from God. His reward was his faithfulness. And for as much as we know about him, in a lot of regards, Caleb was an unsung hero and an example that we can all stand to learn a lot from today. Caleb wholeheartedly surrendered to God, and his life was spared because of it. His life was spared not just because of it, but for it, because he continued to live a faithful life for God from his birth to his death. What a tremendous, tremendous legacy. Certainly something that we can learn from. Caleb wholeheartedly surrendered to God, and he changed not just his life, but the lives of so many others around him. If we could follow that type of example and learn and glean that from this unsung hero today, then I think that that will help us in so many countless ways to strengthen and develop our relationship with God and to help us in our walk. Because a commitment to live 100% for God and to sell it for God is not something that you could just make once. In fact, most of us, if not all of us in this room, did make that decision once. It is a day-by-day, step-by-step decision. It is a lifestyle change that has to take place because it's what we're called for. And we learned that from Caleb. That's our time for this morning. So, you have a question? Closing thought?
Yeah, I was going to quickly ask you, in addition to your theme of selling out for Christ, you may be left alone, you may be on that standalone by yourself, because there's going to be a lot of people that's not on board with that. So you may be left alone, you may be part of that minority, but it's okay. And as you said, he's going to be victorious in that.
Absolutely. And Caleb certainly was in the minority many times in his life. He overcome it. So that's my time for this week. We'll be back with another Unsung Hero next week. Thank you for your time. Have a great week.